Imagine a place with unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no disease, no weather to survive. Every need you could ever have met forever. Sounds like paradise, right? In 1968, a scientist built exactly that. He didn't build it for humans. He built it for mice. And what happened inside that box would go on to haunt urban planners, sociologists, and psychologists for the next 50 years. His name was John B. Calhoun. He worked for the National Institute of Mental Health, and he had spent over a decade obsessed with a single question. What happens to a society when it runs out of problems? Not problems like war or famine. The opposite. What happens when a population is given everything it could possibly want, with nothing left to struggle against? Calhoun built a structure he called Universe 25. It was a metal enclosure about the size of a small room, divided into stacked apartments, connected by mesh tunnels, stocked with endless food dispensers and water bottles. He introduced 4 breeding pairs of mice. That's it. 8 mice into a mouse Eden. For the first few months, nothing unusual happened. The population grew the way populations grow. Slowly at first, then faster. By day 315, the mice numbered in the hundreds. The colony was thriving. Litters were healthy. Mice explored every corner of their new world. It looked for a while like Calhoun had built a perfect society. Then the population kept growing. And something started to shift. Space wasn't actually infinite. Only the food was. As the numbers climbed, more and more mice were forced to compete for the same handful of desirable nesting spots. Dominant males could no longer defend large territories because there were too many challengers. Fights broke out. Then fights became constant. Males that once would have simply been dominant now had to fight daily just to hold their position, and many of them lost. Here's where it gets strange. Defeated males didn't just retreat and try again later. They gave up entirely. Calhoun watched them withdraw into the center of the structure, away from nesting areas, away from status, away from purpose. They stopped defending anything. They stopped mating. They simply existed in tight, passive clusters, grooming themselves obsessively, doing nothing else. Calhoun had a name for this collapse. He called it a behavioral sink. Meanwhile, the female mice were changing too. With males no longer reliably defending nests, some females became aggressive themselves, attacking their own pups, abandoning litters early, driving offspring out before they were ready to survive alone. Infant mortality climbed. Not because of starvation. Not because of disease. Because the social fabric that made caregiving possible had frayed. And then Calhoun documented something even more unsettling. A new type of male began to appear. He called them the beautiful ones. These mice never fought. Never courted a female. Never postured for status. They spent their entire lives eating, sleeping, and grooming their own fur until it gleamed, completely disengaged from every social function a mouse is built for. On the surface they looked flawless. Functionally they were empty. Reproduction in the colony fell toward zero. By day 560, births had stopped almost completely. The population peaked at around 2,200 mice, in a structure that could have physically supported many more. It wasn't a lack of resources that ended Universe 25. There was still food in the dispensers on the final day. It was a lack of roles. A lack of struggle. A lack of anything worth competing, connecting, or striving for. The colony didn't recover. Even when Calhoun later removed small groups of mice and placed them into low-density, resource-rich environments, essentially giving them a second chance, they had already lost the behavioral instincts required to rebuild a functioning society. Within a generation, Universe 25 went extinct. Every single mouse died. Not from violence. Not from famine. From what Calhoun called the death of the spirit, a phrase he chose deliberately, knowing it would provoke people. And it did provoke people. When Calhoun published his findings in the early 1970s, the parallels to human cities were impossible to ignore. Urban theorists cited it as a warning about overcrowding. Psychologists debated whether isolation, status anxiety, and purposelessness in dense modern societies might be triggering something similar in humans. The term behavioral sink entered popular language, showing up in dystopian fiction, urban planning debates, even congressional testimony about prison overcrowding. But here's the part most retellings leave out, and it matters. Later researchers, including behavioral scientists like Jonathan Friedman, pushed back hard on the idea that Calhoun's mice were simply a stand-in for humans. Friedman's own studies on human crowding found that density alone doesn't reliably predict social breakdown in people the way it did in Calhoun's mice. Humans build norms. We create hierarchies that aren't purely physical. We can crowd into a subway car twice a day for 40 years without descending into the collapse Calhoun documented in his colony. The mouse utopia wasn't really a story about population density. It was a story about what happens when every traditional role a creature is built to perform, provider, protector, caregiver, competitor, suddenly has nowhere left to go. That distinction is the part worth sitting with. Calhoun didn't kill his mice with overcrowding. He killed them with something closer to obsolescence. He removed every reason to struggle, and in doing so he accidentally removed every reason to connect. The beautiful ones weren't victims of scarcity. They were victims of abundance without purpose. Which brings the story a little closer to home than most people are comfortable admitting. You don't live in a mouse enclosure. Your struggles are real, your resources are finite, and the comparison only goes so far. But think about how much of daily human meaning has always come from exactly the things Calhoun stripped out of Universe 25. Providing for someone. Being needed by someone. Competing for something that matters. building status through effort rather than being handed it. Strip enough of that away, even gradually, even comfortably, and what's left isn't automatically peace. Sometimes what's left is a very well-fed kind of emptiness. Calhoun ran variations of this experiment more than 25 times over the following decade, refining the design, adjusting the variables. The outcome barely changed. Every single time, no matter how much food, water, and safety he provided, the colonies eventually collapsed under the weight of their own social disintegration. He wasn't looking for a lesson about mice. He said so himself near the end of his career. He was looking for an early warning system. So no, Universe 25 doesn't prove that comfort destroys civilizations, and no, it isn't a perfect mirror for anything happening in a modern city. But it does leave behind an uncomfortable question, one that has outlived the mice, the enclosure, and even Calhoun himself. If every basic need were met and every traditional struggle removed, would connection survive on its own? Or does meaning need friction to exist at all? The mice never got to answer that question. They simply stopped trying. The unlimited food was still there, sitting in the dispensers on the day the last one died.